Hello and welcome to Mr. Warren's OCR B American West Revision. Today we're looking at the final section of the course, focusing on 1877 up to 1900. This is where we've got Rutherford B. Hayes, who is in charge as president in 1877. He's the 19th president of the United States. He's a Republican and essentially sees the end to Reconstruction. Now, when we're talking about Reconstruction, we're of course talking about after the Civil War, when the Americans tried to pull the states together to reform the Union, which had obviously been fractured due to things like slavery during the Civil War. Now, Rutherford B. Hayes, he pledged protection of the rights of black Americans in the South. But at the same time, he did advocate the restoration of wise, honest, and peaceful local self-government. He wanted to withdraw a lot of troops from the South, and he hoped such conciliatory policies would lead to the building of a new Republican Party in the South, to which white businessmen and conservatives would rally. He did struggle to win over the South, though, due to the deep divisions after the Civil War. Reconstruction changed pretty much everything and everyone in America, and particularly the South. And it didn't only affect personal lives and marriages and families, but also work and play and even physical things such as houses, churches, and schools. And reconstructing the Union meant putting together a world without slavery, a new birth of freedom, as Lincoln would want to put it, in large ways and small ways. So Rutherford Hayes does have a massive, massive task on his hand to oversee the end this kind of Reconstruction period that we see. And it was a revolution that turned the world upside down. Anyway, enough of that. Let's move on. So, we're going to be starting off focusing on big business. Now, what we see during this time is big business increase dramatically, and we get big corporations who come in and take over smaller industries. We got corporations such as the American Tobacco Company, who control a lot of land during this time, and we see a big rise in wage workers. So these are people working for a wage instead of owning their own land. And these do provide lots of opportunities for many Americans. Now we can break the big business down into three areas. We've got the growth of cotton and tobacco, we've got farms and ranches, and we've got minerals. Okay, so first of all, on the left-hand side of this table, as you can see, we've got a little description of the business, and on the right-hand side, the impact on the Americans. So the first thing we're going to start off with is cotton mills. Now, they double in the South between 1880 to 1900. After the Civil War, we do see a drop-off in the use of cotton mills, primarily as people are still rebuilding after the war. But around 1880, we do see the cotton mills double, and they come back into big business. And the American Tobacco Company also comes in at this time, and they control around 90% of production. And of course, if one big company owns lots and lots of small businesses and forms them into a corporation, they're going to be able to control wages. There's lots of high demand for cotton and tobacco. And what we find is it's mainly poorly paid black Americans or sharecroppers who are picking the cotton and tobacco during this time. We do see a big rise in factories which do create jobs, but again, they're very poorly paid. And any kind of decent job during this time is essentially given to the whites. And as we said, the American Tobacco Company control 90% of production. And this means that they have no competition from others and therefore can afford to keep paying low wages to their employees. Second section here is all about the farms and ranches. Now, what we see is bonanza farms come up. Now, bonanza farms are massive, around 10,000 acres, and ranches begin to appear all over America. So think of your typical cowboys. And again, it's only a few people who own these farms, and therefore they eliminate a lot of the competition. And of course, they got the best land available, which meant any kind of competition suffered massively because the land wasn't as fertile. And people who couldn't afford their own land would go and work on these bonanza farms. We also see a huge rise in violence and intimidation from ranchers. So these are obviously the people who were on the ranches. And we find black Americans and the poor do suffer to this violence. Again, it's a way of stopping the competition. And And finally, we end with minerals. So with the Transcontinental Railway sweeping all the way from the Appalachian Mountains all the way to the Sierra Nevada, we see a rise in the coal, iron, steel, and even the oil industry during this time. And it increased tenfold between 1875 and 1890. But surprise, surprise, once again, we get big corporations lead the way. And what we find is lots and lots of big businessmen, such as Rockefeller. He buys up all of the small competition around him. And in fact, after consulting my James West Davidson's A Little History of the United States, Rockefeller by 1880 controlled 90% of all the oil refined in the United States. And we've got another businessman, Andrew Carnegie, who takes over the steel industry as well. And he uses the latest technology to turn iron into steel and therefore makes lots of money. And again, he looks at Rockefeller's strategy of buying up these others, but he doesn't. He just purchases other businesses, such as other steel companies who needed to survive. So he kind of finances all of them, and he builds his own huge industry, a bit like a bonanza steel mine, I suppose. And these big corporations, again, offer low pay. Because there isn't any competition, people cannot complain. They have to go to work. Now, we do see trade unions at this time. So these are trying to protect the rights of the workers. And these, they kind of said to the workers, well, if you're not happy, let's go on strike. And of course, when they did strike, they were attacked by local militia. So the local militia would be armed, they would come over and they would kick off any strikers from the mines. And then what we found is this void that was left of work was given to Black Americans and Mexicans, because they essentially would take any work available to them to provide any kind of means for their family. And the trade unions therefore have limited power. Because you've got the local militia attacking them, there's not much they can really do. And anyone who was part of a trade union gets blacklisted, so they get struck off the workers list, which means they find it really hard to then go and get some work. So this is the big business. Now, the big business obviously is going to lead to the growth in other areas. And what we find is the big growth of cities. Now, as it says on the screen there, in 1870 there are 14 cities. Apologies for the interruption on the phone call then. Okay, sorry. So in 1870 there are 14 cities with more than 100,000 people. And by 1900 this more than doubled to 38. Again, the growth of business leads to the growth of cities. And these cities control the local water supplies, and they use these to increase their power, which attracts more settlers to the area. Because we get an increase in settlers coming to these cities, we see lots and lots of overcrowding. And as you can see from the images down here, this leads to disease. Okay, we get in Chicago, 60% of babies died before they reached 1. So we've got a high infant mortality rate at this time, with sometimes 32 families sharing a 6 to 8 story tenement block. Link this to your people's health unit as well. We see obviously lots and lots of people coming to areas, and this increases the spread of disease, especially because there isn't the infrastructure in place to provide things like waste disposal early on in the growth of these cities. Now, despite this, they did draw in people with promises of work, entertainment, education, and freedom. And surprisingly, women and Black Americans do gain lots and lots of benefits during the growth of cities. They actually helped forge the path for suffrage in the 1920s, for example. And as we look at later on, in Kansas, for example, lots of Black Americans do get a good education. Now, the growth of the cities is not just primarily focused on Americans already in the country at this time. We see a huge mass migration coming in, primarily from Europe and Asia, which essentially is going to lead to the economy booming, because you've got more people coming in, more people buying things. Okay, so we get lots of minorities come over too, and lots of religious groups. So we get lots of Jewish people coming in. We also get lots of Buddhists, for example. And again, we know America is built on this idea of European settlers coming over and spreading Christianity to lots and lots of people. So we know that religion during this time is very big, and the church as an institution does grow during this time. Now, because travel becomes cheaper, because it becomes quicker, we do get lots and lots of immigrants come over. And as you can see there on the screen, 600,000 immigrants came from Italy alone. Now, they set up language tests and lots of medical examinations to kind of determine who they wanted to enter at the time. And we see Ellis Island. So Ellis Island opens up to process all the migrants. And of course, they could see the Statue of Liberty, which was a gift from the French. And they were met with lots of violence and laws to stop some people from working. Believe it or not, they're very, very fussy with who they wanted in the country at this time, even though we see America as this melting pot of the world with lots of people, people come from different cultures, different races, different religions. But we see the Chinese suffer massively during this time, and lots of these immigrants initially become very, very poor and struggle to survive in the cities. So that is all about the white Americans at this time and how big businesses and the growth of cities affected them. So the next part of this video is going to focus on the black Americans. And we've got this question here. Did life change for black Americans after Reconstruction? Now, predominantly, life does change for the black Americans. However, this isn't always positive. Now, by the time the Civil War ends, some planters have come to see that slavery was wrong and that the Declaration of Independence meant more than they had ever been able to see before. They really wanted to promote this idea of equality. And we know America was built, as I've said, on this idea of this melting pot of society. So therefore, why should black Americans be treated so poorly? Now, Southerners did recognise that slavery should end, but even so, their new state governments passed what we know as the Black Codes. So I'm just going to quote you from the book again. So these were laws restricting former slaves. While African Americans could now own property, be married legally, and sue in court, Black Codes forbade them from testifying against whites or serving on juries. Carrying on, the codes also allowed freed people to be arrested on vague charges, such as having no home or regular work. Once arrested, they could be hired out to planters and forced to work. To Northerners, this seemed little more than slavery under a different name. Southern voters also elected high rebel officials to Congress, including the former Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens. So what we see is the Black Codes is really increasing segregation. We're supposed to see this idea that slavery is going to be abolished after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, but the Black Codes are just kind of this disguise for slavery still happening. Now we see, as I've mentioned in the first few slides, that the cotton industry does collapse after the Civil War, but again this picks up towards the end of the 1870s. Now, blacks had been prevented from getting better paid jobs, so were almost forced to continue working on cotton plantations and tobacco plantations, obviously with very, very low wages. And the majority of blacks in the South worked as what we call sharecroppers on land owned by former slaveholders. So they weren't what we would call slaves, but essentially it was a form of slavery still. And even in the north, I just noticed the typo on my slide there, apologies. The northern challenges. Now, lots of black Americans obviously were not happy with the situation down in the south. So lots of them did go to the north. But even in the north, who had obviously fought for the abolition of slavery, there was still lots and lots of racism. And again, they were paid less for the same jobs, even if they were more qualified than their white counterparts. So we do see lots of negatives during this time. What we also see is President Johnson this time. He actually pardons over 13,000 former slave owners. Very, very different to Abraham Lincoln, who we had before. And many Northerners were shocked to hear that 10 former Confederate generals, so remember the Confederacy is the soldiers from the South, had been elected to serve in Congress. And worse, when Republicans objected, Johnson began calling them traitors for giving black citizens too many rights. And we see a big rise in white mobs attacking African Americans at this time, specifically around Memphis and New Orleans. And it's not until Congress lays out a much stricter approach for protecting the blacks in the South that we see the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And this guarantees that no citizen, including African Americans, could be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Essentially, this meant that every citizen deserved equal protection under the law, which meant the black codes were unconstitutional. So let's flip it over and let's see what positives we had towards the end of this Reconstruction period. And of course, we get Kansas. Now, Kansas was opened up at this time for lots and lots of black Americans, and the Homestead Act gets opened up to these, where they were given land by the government so that they could settle. In 1877, Benjamin Singleton even tries to encourage ex-slaves to move there and claim land. So Singleton, he's partially responsible for this huge rise in black Americans going to Kansas. And they were taking up the opportunity passed to them by the government. And we see around 6,000 black Americans moving to Kansas by 1880. It even doubled to more than 12,000. And these were known as exodusters. So the exodusters was a name given to African Americans who migrated from states along Mississippi all the way up to Kansas in the late 19th century. It was the first general migration of black people following the Civil War, which was why it was so key. And this leads me on to talking about education, and we get Booker T. Washington. Now, Booker T. Washington, he was an American educator, author, orator, and advisor to multiple presidents, and he was what we could safely say was one of the black elites, and he led the way for lots and lots of education. Now, he sets up a school to train black children to be farmers, craftsmen, and house servants. Now, he was widely criticised for a lot of his role in setting up the education system here. Some black people thought that he wasn't setting this up in the correct way, and he actually was accused of isolating lots and lots of black Americans during this time. By 1900, he'd established the Negro Business League, which meant black teachers. We get lots and lots of doctors and lawyers at this time, really becoming integral to American society. 23,866 black teachers by 1900, 417 doctors and 300 lawyers. Now that is a huge increase, and I don't think we can underestimate the impact that Booker T. Washington does have for the opportunities of black Americans. Now, unfortunately, there is again another flip side to this, and what we see are the Jim Crow laws coming into play. Now, the Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. It was named after a black minstrel show character, where the laws, which existed for about 100 years from the post-Civil War era, were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, or other opportunities. And anyone who defied the Jim Crow laws often faced arrest, fines, jail sentences, violence, and often they were put to death. So we see a real rise in segregation. And remember, segregation is the splitting up of people. It could be based on things like gender, it could be based on things like race, and of course, in this case, it was. Now, the Jim Crow laws kind of begin as early as 1865, immediately following the ratification of the 13th Amendment, the Emancipation Proclamation, which abolished slavery in the United States. And we know these were combined with the Black Codes, as we've already spoken about. Now, the whole legal system at this time was firmly stacked against the black Americans. And this led to lots of incarcerations, it led to lots of prisoners becoming enslaved people again, and black offenders typically did receive longer sentences than any of their white equals. And because of the grueling work, they often didn't live out their entire sentence. So we see a massive rise in deaths of black Americans due to Jim Crow laws at this time. And as you can see from the image there, toilets were segregated, we've got cinemas segregated as well, diners as well, where you'd have white Americans at the front and often the black diners towards the back. If you haven't seen the film Mississippi Burning, it is an 18, so guidance needed. Very horrific film, but it does highlight the segregation we do see under the Jim Crow laws. Now, during this time, we do have some people fighting back, and of course, we've got the abolitionists at this time, but we've also got some black heroes such as Ida B. Wells. Now, as oppressive as the Jim Crow era was, we do see many African Americans do step into leadership roles at this time to oppose these laws. Now, Ida B. Wells, she was a teacher, and she becomes a prominent activist against against the Jim Crow laws. And she refuses to leave a first-class train car designated for whites only. As she gets forcibly removed by the conductor, and she then goes and sues the railroad successfully. And that was really key, because what we see is with the Jim Crow laws, We get lots and lots of laws put against them. We get the Black Americans marginalized, but actually she wins the case at court, although it was reversed later on. But it did show that Black Americans were having a voice at this time. Now, she was obviously very, very angered at the injustice, and she did devote herself to fighting the Jim Crow laws for the rest of her career. She did lots and lots of writing for newspapers, and in 1889 she did become co-owner of the Memphis Free Speech. And she used her position to take on any kind of school segregation and sexual harassment that Black Americans did face. Unfortunately, during this time, we do see the rise of another racist, white supremacist group, and arguably one of the founding white supremacist groups of America, which is, of course, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. And the Civil War, it does lead to a rise in violence against Black Americans towards the end of the 1800s. Now, the Ku Klux Klan were notorious for wearing their white hooded gowns, and they did lots and lots of violence against Black Americans, including lynchings too, burnings down of churches. And many southern states were still run by ex-slaveholders at this time, and these were often called redeemer governments. And what these redeemer governments were doing was trying to undo any changes that had happened from the Civil War, so undoing the Emancipation Proclamation, for example. And what the southern governments do is they bring in these literacy tests to stop the blacks from voting, and they introduce further segregation laws. So in 1905, we see just 1,342 Black Americans vote in Louisiana, which shows you this this period of intimidation really does work for the Ku Klux Klan. Now, if you haven't seen Russell Howard and his Good News show, he does one for Sky, and he talks to the jazz musician Daryl Davis. It's on YouTube. I strongly suggest you watch it. And Daryl Davis, he's a black jazz musician, he's a comedian, he's a writer, and he essentially converts over 200 members of the Ku Klux Klan, which is just fantastic. And I strongly suggest you watch his documentary on Amazon Prime, Accidental Courtesy. It's very, very eye-opening. Now, this leads me on to the final part of this presentation, and we're going to be talking about Native Americans during this time and how they kind of deal with the end of the Reconstruction era. And of course, it is a very, very sad ending to our course because we know the natives, they suffer from lots and lots of oppression during this time. And of course, we get the Great Sioux Wars, we get the Great Sioux War of 1876, we get the Battle of Little Bighorn, and of course it ends with Wounded Knee in 1890. Now, the Great Sioux War, we know, is a military expedition to protect the railway surveyors and gold prospectors in the Black Hills by the government, and this triggers the war with the Sioux. And the government do make an offer to buy the Black Hills from the Sioux, which was rejected. Now, we know the Black Hills were part of the native culture, all about their spirits that they believed in, and we do get the military campaign that follows, leads to the Battle of Little Bighorn. And we know this is where General Custer, he gets slaughtered by Sitting Bull and the Sioux. And this is in 1876. Now, the one I really want to focus on here is just because of time is Wounded Knee. Now, after the Great Sioux War, many Plains tribes were forced into government reservations where they were split up. And we know that lots of these tribes do come into conflict with each other because all of a sudden they are forced to live in a smaller area of land across the Great Plains. So, Wounded Knee in 1890. Now, a Native American man, he receives this vision about a Messiah coming. And if the Plains Indians remained peaceful and danced the ghost dance, then a new world would come where all the white people would disappear and the buffalo would return. What we need to remember is that the white settlers had started to eradicate much of the buffalo during this time, selling their hides, selling their meat, making goods out of them as well. And of course, they killed a lot of the buffalo's homeland because of building the railways and the mines. So what we see is the American Indians fighting back during this ghost dance. Now, the ghost dance religion, it spreads rapidly across these reservations, and we get lots and lots of different native tribes doing this at the time. Now, the American government, they feel very, very threatened by this, and they ban it. And many Native Americans go totally against this, and they join Bigfoot. Now, Bigfoot was a Plains Indian chief at the time who becomes this icon, this leader of the ghost dance. Now, because it had been banned, the Americans do send in the army, and they send in the US 7th Cavalry. And they caught up with Bigfoot and his followers, and they took them under guard to a camp at Wounded Knee, because obviously this was against the law to the Americans at the time. So while the soldiers were removing their weapons, a Sioux warrior resisted and he opened fire. And what we see is this huge retaliation from the white settlers, these white American soldiers. And we see 146 Indians slaughtered pretty much immediately, along with 25 white soldiers. And among the dead Native Americans were old men, women, and children. And this massacre literally ends this massacre literally ends these wars over the Great Plains, because we see the big chiefs go, see like Bigfoot go, we see Sitting Bull, for example, and it really does signal the end of the Native Indians. Now, this leads me on to the destruction of culture. So, the US government do lots and lots of things to destroy the Plains culture during this time. They take control of Indian courts and they make them mirror the American legal system. Children who didn't speak English were beaten by many white Americans, and many get forced to move to Christian boarding schools. Now, what you need to really consider here is that the Native Indians were very spiritual people. They had lots of their own beliefs. So all of a sudden being forced into this Christian way of living would have really, really affected them. And it does lead to the end of their culture as they knew it. And of course, we know they get split up into different reservations. And as I've already said, they had to kind of sit on top of each other, living in such a... Although the Great Plains was huge, having lots of different tribes there, it really made it feel quite small and claustrophobic. We know that they used the buffalo for things like teepees, and this was no longer allowed. They had to live in houses in these reservations. And finally, English names were chosen. So they were forced to rename any children to English names. And of course, history then favoured the whites, and we often talk about this whitewashing of history. And the American Indians were taught that the white settlers were the good people. They were the ones spreading this ideology of Christianity to everyone, and that it was the natives who were the aggressive group during the transformation of the American West. And finally, this leads me to the Friends of the Indians. This nice idea that lots of white Americans set up to basically protect the rights of the Native Indians. And what they wanted to do was to keep their culture. They really, really wanted to protect them. They lots of them were abolitionists, essentially, who had seen the end of the Civil War. They'd seen the idea of the Black Americans being treated horrifically. So they wanted to protect the Native Indians. Now, what we found at this time was lots of government agents who ran the reservations were incredibly corrupt. So the Friends of the Indians, they report them and they monitor expenditure. So they look at all their accounts, they make sure they're running the reservations properly, and they're not taking advantage of the Native Indians. Because lots of these Indian children didn't have a formal education, Friends set them up with lessons to learn English. They wanted to help them get jobs with the white Americans in these big cities. And although this sounds great, what you've got to remember is lots of the Native Indian culture was kind of based on hunting, gathering, and this kind of nomadic lifestyle. So all of a sudden, to be forced to learn English and be forced to have white American jobs, should we call it at this time, really did upset them. And of course, they didn't have citizenship. They couldn't vote. They couldn't vote in this new system, even though it was now mirrored to the American legal system. So the Friends, they persuade the government to pass the Dawes Act in 1887, and this gave Indians 160 acres of land and citizenship if they gave up their tribal lands. Again, as brilliant as that sounds, getting the Native Indians to give up their tribal lands was a massive, massive insult. These were sacred to them, they were holy to them. The Sioux, for example, obviously prayed to Wakan Tanka, who was their spiritual leader. So to get them to give up their tribal lands for any old land that the white Americans had given them was really an insult. And we know that it does, the Friends of the Indians were set up with nice aims, but it really does lead to the destruction of the Native Indians per se. They're one of the reasons why the Indians lost all their lands. So by 1900, we get 2/3 of Indian land in the hands of the whites, which goes to show that resistance was really futile against the big power of the American government. And that's it for the revision of 1877 to 1900. Any questions, please ask. Hopefully that wasn't too bad for my first talk video behind a microphone. Hopefully get a webcam for next time. Thank you for listening.